All right, cool. So thanks for coming today. One of the things we've noticed in our series of who's getting engaged with the marketing part of our workshop series is that a lot of times people have a great idea and they think it's wonderful, and then they hand off the task of finding people to engage in their process to someone, and then they blast at everyone. You know, everybody has a wrist, therefore everybody must have a watch, and so we're going to sell everybody on having this man's watch that only fits on the hands of people with the wrist the size of an elephant, right? And they do not do the sub-market analysis to find out where the product customer match is, and they specifically do not understand the difference between finding a market that's the largest market and finding the market that's the fastest market to revenue. And since the most of the people here are early in their revenue, my argument would be, how do we get to the right submarket that goes fastest, that's big enough to get us to cash flow positive, and the right people in that market that will help us do that now instead of having a long sales cycle, so that we can get there quickly. And we've been having a long conversation at the Open Coffees with Patrick around finding the right psychographic of the people in your submarket. And we're going to dive deeper into that question. So Patrick, would you introduce yourself a little bit and then dive into the process?
Sure. I'll let me bring up the deck and start that conversation. Use that to introduce myself. I'm doing a share. Hope you all see it. And so I'm my own shop. Gateway Adopters LLC is my company. I have been doing V1s for about 25 years. In fact, only one product have I ever been involved with as a product manager or product planner where it already was in market. So I've a lot of scar tissue of trying to determine what is the most best market fit the fastest. More general background, since we have 2 hours, I'll give a little. I am an engineer by upbringing and training. My whole family is STEM people, and did the engineering thing, did the Boeing thing, went back when I said, hey, this is no way to do innovation. This is not the best way to create great new things. So I went back and did my MBA at Dartmouth and have been practicing a combination of what I learned at both places and tools and developing new tools. And so today we're going to talk about some of the tools. And in fact, some people, there's Tom Malone, for instance, has seen some of these. And by the way, so the layout today is, I'm going to talk about why focusing on a customer discovery is really valuable and how much of it is really appropriate. Talk about some language, put some kind of models out there. And then after that, we're going to dig into some of the things that we talked about already, which is, well, how do you really go about doing this the right amount, enough? So that's the general layout. So we have talked about a mix of founders, a mix of participants, a mix of others. So I'll skip that today. We have some people who are interested. And you know, the core of, and I think about half of you or a little less than half of you saw the last session we did about a month ago, where we talked about what I call top risk now, which is where do you focus? And it starts with the fact that, you know, most founders are acting more like dev managers than they are company owners and company managers, where they focus on their product, they bet a ton on their product, and it results in a really big bet because they're doing kind of a version of the, if they build it, hopefully they'll come. And, you know, 99% of the time it fails. And so what we're here to talk about is, how do you find the right customer? And the axiom is, this is the biggest place for you as a manager to get the right payoff, is focusing on this part of it, not necessarily working on your product per se, is the biggest payoff for what you do. And this is a little story. This describes what we see. John sees, I've seen, whether it was in enterprise or whether it was in startups. I have about half my time in enterprise and half my time in startups. Is teams do what they're comfortable with. They do what they know. And usually they're good technologists, and they think about dependencies, and they use Agile and MVP, and they just fail faster using these tools. And they might use some design thinking. When they get feedback, they're confused. They're going, well, what's going on here? Is this the right market? Are we talking to the right people? Are we compelling? They might even ask those questions. But then you ask them, well, what are you doing to address those issues? And they're going, well, I'm just doing faster. I'm doing MVP faster, because that's the hammer that they know. And so that's what they're using. And everything looks like a nail. They're developing their product, they're polishing their product, and they're just banging the heck out of it. And the lesson that came from the last conversation is, you know what, there's a whole other risk other than technology risk that you need to think about. And often it's very late in the sequence. It's not the biggest risk. And so we're going to say, hey, stop doing what you're doing and focus on the thing that you're going to get the best response. And the people who are stuck in this MVP Agile model are crafting and polishing, whether it's a service or a product. They're unwittingly in this big bet death mark where they're just betting and betting and betting on the product and not thinking about the other big risks. And the other risks that you have to think about are, if you're going to build a company, you got to act like an investment manager and look at all the resources and where you're going to get a good ROI for your time. And you need to stop working on the low ROI stuff. And per that graph, polishing technology is often not it. But no one's told you what the other ones are. You haven't had exposure to that. And so what we're going to talk about today is the one that usually gets the biggest return. And just to do a quick recap of last month, there are these 6 kinds of risks. So when I go in and look at what's going on with the product, wherever I enter it, whenever I look at the project, I look at these risks and I say, which one are the ones that are most likely going to kill you right now? Which is the highest one? And I follow practices that I've learned have been successful for people who constantly pursue risk. And I go after one at a time and focus and mitigate that risk. And this is something I learned when I looked after these people I call gateway adopters, because they constantly pursue risk. And I said, hey, how do they succeed at this? And what they do is in their sprint planning, they look at the risk that's going to hurt them the most, and they build a lean cycle that addresses that specific risk type with the best tool for that risk. And then they work on it until it's no longer the top risk. So this is a big key in how you manage and how you think about the project. So we'll get into this later, because where I'm setting some dialogue and models is you work on this particular issue until it's good enough, and you just stop and you shift to something else when you solved it. So then you move on. You satisfy with whatever you're doing. And the execution issues that we're going to talk about later, and how do you go find people, how do you filter, how do you get information, well, this will come up. So value risk, just to talk about it, is, would a decision maker buy it? So that's the key risk that you're trying to address. The other ones have to do with, do you have the funding to go after the project? Does your team have the skills to actually execute? Can someone get the value out of it? Is it usable? Does everything work in the design work? Does it perform? And notice this is the technology dimension. Does it go fast enough? Is it compatible? And then the follow is go to market. Will they buy it from us? Do they need to buy it from someone else? What's the price point? What's the bundle? So when I go in and look at what's most likely going to kill a project, I look and I listen to which one of these are really going to be the highest. But typically, the best thing I can do is to say, stop working, triage, stop working on the biggest risks or the lowest risks. Even if we argue about, well, which one's number one and which one's number two, it's a benefit just to say, stop thinking and putting cycles into the stuff that's not your top risk. And John and I have discussions about whether it's team risk sometimes or value risk, and will probably come up later in the conversation. But I put to you early in your cycle, trying to decide what you're going to spend your time on and where you should build a team and what you're going to prove to an investor that you have value. All these are gated on some proof that somebody thinks that you're worth spending money on. And so, this is where I say you're not a dev manager anymore. You're not a product manager. You're supposed to act like an investor and stop spending money on low value sprints when they don't have a good ROI. So the premise is, if you want to land your revenues fast and you want to do strategic customer development to mitigate that big risk, we'll talk about how do you do that cheaply, quickly, so you get on track. So who are the right people? And knowing that 90% of the people in any market are going to give you noise. What is the right sub-market? Because there are lots of them, and some of them are going to be way easier for you to enter than others, or to be interesting to. And then what's compelling enough? And so not just viable, not just it works, but it's actually, an elegant function, but it actually is something that someone's highly motivated to give you money. So today we talked about the problem. People are making big bets because they're working on their product. They're not focusing on the biggest challenge they have. In this case, when you're early in the cycle, we're saying, hey, look at your high stakes issues and focus on those issues. Make sure you find the challenge is, how do you find the right buyers? How do you make sure which is the right market? And how do you define what's compelling for them? And we're going to walk through ways I've helped teams figure that out. And again, Tom will probably jump in, I think, once in a while, especially when we get into the discussion, and we'll walk through it and say, okay, if this is what you're trying to do, how are the ways you can do it? And again, some of the discussion has already led that. So how do you decide what it is, who you could go after? How do you target and select and go after them? How do you validate who they are and validate what you have is actually compelling? So the vision is, just imagine if you're talking to if you're engaged with the right people in the right market with something that's compelling, people will line up and say, shut up and take my money. And luckily I've had a few of those where we've done the work, and that's actually what happens, where I've shown them something and they've found it compelling. We'll talk a little bit about some of my projects later when we talk about execution, where we said, okay, what is the issue? What's the top risk? We said value's the right thing, and we decided what's the best tool we're going to use to go engage with customers. And in different projects, it's a little different. It's not always the same, but we know we're trying to do the same thing. So the three keys: right people, right market, and then something that's compelling. So the first section is, well, what's the right person in a market? And this is where some of you have been on the conversations, and some of you may have attended some of the workshops that John has asked me, where we rely heavily on the concept of the adoption curve. And in every market, there is a range of people in that market with the exact same demographics, the same, everything on paper looks the same, but because of evolution and what drives success and survival, there's a broad range of coping mechanisms from one end to another. And we're going to spend our time talking about a group that actually leads the market. Some people are way ahead of the market, and some people actually are the leader indicators of where a market will go and love the idea of new and different things. So again, the premise of this is, and the thing, as a product manager, I would go out and do research, and I was constantly frustrated because most of the information I was getting was just confusing and contradictory. And then when I thought about this curve and the work and research that I'd seen done on the adoption curve, I realized that I needed a way to filter out the 90% of the people who will tell me what they want. And two things will happen: is they may buy, but they're not a signal to the larger market, so it's a bad signal. Or they'll tell me a lot, but they will never buy. They will talk your ear off and tell you what they want, but they'll never purchase something new that's unproven. So the three different mindsets are generally the really optimistics, the crazy people who love new stuff, really optimistic on the front. And then largely the last three groups actually fall into this mainstream, where when you get to mass market, you have this mainstream group that are the established buyers. That is where most marketing, like MBAs, learn how to go after this market and what to say to them and how to go to them, what it takes to work with them. But they are low or no risk purchasing people. they will only buy what's proven. That's why they look, the standard MBA thing is to say, look, there's 1 million people using this, because that's what they want to hear. And again, if they're the 70% of the market that will engage and never buy your new concept as much as they'll talk to you. So in between this group, there's a group that Jeffrey Moore calls the chasm. And I say they're people. It isn't a gap. They're the people for which there's lots of new ideas and only a few of them get through. So they are the actual leading indicators. And I did a ton of research, and I really mean a ton, several years, huge data analytics over really complex models, over 400,000 data points on almost 4,000 projects on how people made complex decisions on high stakes projects. And it turns out that there's this group that I call gateway adopters that have certain personality characteristics that are the 10% in a market, maybe even less, maybe more in some, that are the ones that actually are the lead indicators. And they're the people who will tell you the value they need from you in order to adopt your new idea. Because they have an outcome they want, not because it's cool and new, but because you're going to solve a problem that the whole market has, and they know how to actually use a new thing. So the key is, and what I had to do with my research is, how do I find them? How do I walk in a room and filter out the 90% of the people that are going to give me the wrong signal for value? And it turns out that they have a healthy relationship with risk. And so if you think about any relationship dynamic, they want to win and they want to get a competitive advantage. So when you have a conversation, if this doesn't pop up, you may not be talking to the right person. But they love to take risks, but they do it in a very, very diligent way. And they manage it very rigorously. And they also have this rule that pops up and people hear about it and they see it once in a while. They don't know how to make sense of it. These guys are the strongest users of the satisficing rule. They good enough. When you've hit good enough, then they move on to the next thing. And earlier I talked about the top risk now model. This is where I saw it happen. They do it in several places, but they mitigate their biggest risk on a project. And when they're good enough, even if it's messy, they move on because there's someplace else they will get a better return for their time and energy. And that's why John and I are strongly arguing for stop working on a bunch of stuff that's fun and but work on this effort in engaging. So this group has a track record of successfully adopting something new and different, the breakthrough thing. They look at the stuff that's on the front. They may even shop across it. But then when they look and say, does it help me win? And so they're pragmatic. And that's something Moore talks about is, if it has a pragmatic outcome, great. And that's why 85% of the stuff on the front doesn't make it, because it's interesting, it's new, but it doesn't actually help somebody solve an important issue. So before I run on, any questions? We're going to talk about how you find that and how you put this to work later when we talk about engaging the market and filtering. Any questions before I jump on to the next one?
Patrick, is one of your key points to be careful to avoid the first group, because they'll kind of take anything, and so then I get lulled into thinking I've got customers when really I just have people who like new stuff, and they'll probably walk away later.
Yeah, so this is where John and I have a debate. And so when you're trying to mitigate your value risk and understand what will likely be a consistent enough value to get into a market, the answer is yes. When you switch to another risk type where you're saying, I need to just test out a technology and see if it works. I need to make sure my team is functional. When you have other risk types for which the market you sell to doesn't have to indicate value to you, then great, you can talk to them. But understand that when you're mitigating your value risk on what will people pay for, realize that the signal you're going to get on the front is not one you should follow, because it will never be consistent. It's going to be like popcorn, even if you do it. The reason 85% don't make it is there's a whole bunch of stuff going on all over this group. They're doing a bunch of stuff. 85% is never going to make it any farther. And so that's never consistent. And so, yes, you may be successful at getting somebody, but it's not a value signal. It's, does your team work? Can they produce something? Does the technology layer you're worried about that will support your value work? So there are good reasons to engage with that group. It's just not to mitigate your value risk. Does that answer your question, Mark?
So
Yes.
to nerd out a little bit more, Mark used the term the first group, and the first group, according to
There's
this
two.
diffusion of innovation, is the innovators, and the innovators are not now and never will be your customer for the large market. They're the do-it-yourself people that you sell picks and shovels to, but they're not the people that will buy your product because they're the innovators and they build new things. And what Patrick was just talking about is the second group, which is the early adopters. Are we talking about the early adopters? Or are we talking about the late early adopters? And the early adopters are driven by being fans of new things. And the late early adopters are this group of people that are pragmatic, trying to win. And so he's distinguishing the front and back of that second group, where I would argue that nobody in this group, unless you're building something for the do-it-yourselfers, should be focusing on the innovators. However, you should be looking at the innovators as a source of content and proof of market from a content point of view, but not from a sales point of view.
Does that answer your question? Or I think.
Yeah. Now, I think the key thing I'm hearing is, because I've always believed this too, that it's anybody can fool themselves into thinking that they have a business by getting a customer. And
Right.
if that customer is from that early adopter, that's why, right? Because they tried it. Yeah, they'll use it for a little while, then they'll move on. They just want it
To
because
try
it's
anything.
novel. Yeah, right.
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Now, I justified the research that I did to help drive Microsoft's most valuable API by saying, I can't rely on Microsoft customer base to go after a new concept in development. I need to go after the real leaders, and we need to filter out the normal customer. And that's how I got funding, is I needed to find the indicator for where the market was going, not where it is, not where it was, but where it was going to be. And that's what this group tends to be. Since they demand you actually have an outcome that helps them beat everybody else behind them, they tend to be really, really specific and very accurate in their predictiveness of where the market's going to go. 15 years ago, where I was doing this, that talk about how good at decisions they made that still are holding true because we engage with this group and not the rest of the market. So I'll move on to the next.
We lost him.
Am I back?
You are back.
Now you're back, yes.
Can you guys hear me now?
Patrick? Yes, you're back.
You're all frozen.
Yes, yes, we hear you.
We are not frozen to each other, but we can understand.
We can do the wavy thing and help everybody see that everybody's moving, right? No? Patrick, are you getting in yet, or are you still blocked? So while Patrick just dropped off and he's going to come back on, there we go. I think that it's probably worth talking about the diffusion of innovation. It's the original book where all of this innovation and the process by which subgroups come in. And so that led then, it's like 1968 kind of book. And then that led to the Geoffrey Moore process, where Geoffrey Moore then talked about applying this diffusion to marketing. And that marketing then led to a discussion about how there's a group of people that engage in new things differently than the normal population. So that's really been really useful when we start thinking about how people engage in the marketplace. And so I need to give him the link of how to get in. Hold on a second. Does anybody have any questions about any of the early adopter stuff that he was talking about?
Just kind of quick hits of like how you start sorting them, right? Like you have somebody that comes to you and it's like, oh, they check mark a lot of boxes, but really they're an early adopter, or really they're a do-it-yourselfer. I suppose that's something you get better at figuring out.
Well, so, you know, it's the kinds of questions they ask of you that define a lot of that, right? If they're, for example, we talk about startups should never lead with price because price is not the thing that the early adopters care about. They're typically willing to pay more. And so if they're asking who else is using this, that's immediately an indicator that that they are in the bottom three groups in some level, right? And so you can watch certain kinds of engagement. If they're asking about what kinds of things have been done before, that's not it. But if you ask about how this creates value, how it specifically engages, then that becomes something that's an indicator. So they typically are clear on their goals. They've sorted and prioritized their goals, and they're effective at that. And then they're pretty clear about what the thing that's in the way for that particular goal, and they're trying to lower that barrier to achieving that goal. And so they just keep working on the piece of the puzzle that blocks them from achieving their goal most. And when that stops being the most, they switch to the thing that's currently blocking them the most. They don't fix it all the way, they just get it out of the way.
And this is one of the, sorry about the network problems. Not sure where they're coming from. I have cleared the decks on this end, so I'm not sure what's happening. But anyway, one of the things that's an important dynamic for you guys as entrepreneurs is once we're going to go into this, I'm going to talk through how do you find out those two things that John just talked about. What are their goals and what's getting in the way? You don't have to make that thing go away. You just have to be a better option than anything else that they're looking at. So, you know, don't feel, I worked with a couple of customers where they thought they had to make whatever that problem is disappear. It's like, no, 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 you just have to be better than anything else. They're used to it. This is the third or fourth thing they've done to try to get to that goal. And you just have to be better than what they've tried before and they'll use it. Now, it would be awesome if you made it go away. Don't get me wrong, but don't feel that you have to make it go to zero. So John, this next was, okay, now I want to say there's markets, and John is also could add a lot here, where in any market, there are many, many sub buyers. And I think I want to open up the gates for John because I say, like, if you wanted to sell, here's a great example of a mobile app for education. One of these targets could be the student. Another one could be his grandparent, that person's grandparents. Another one could be the teacher. Another one could be a district. Another one could be a state or local government. Another one could be federal. So there are many, many potential targets for which you can go to. And what we'll talk about a little bit later when we talk about defining compelling is what are their goals and how can your thing be compelling about it, the best, better than what they have today, and the easiest for you to get there. So there are going to be some of those decision makers for which you can remove a barrier quickly, and others that will be very, very tough. And in John's example, you know, if you tried to sell the federal government, you'd die before you'd actually make a deal. But if you maybe go for a grandparent, maybe there's something simple that they want, which is maybe their solution is they just want to know their kid is doing something that's relevant to a topic they care about. And that's it. Just information. And so the barrier for compelling, or the work you need to do to be novel to them, will be lower. And so going through the process of being clear about each of these markets and what they're trying to achieve. I'll even kind of give a prelude to the next section a little bit and say, even for my services, when I think about how I can help somebody who might be an investor, an angel investor, who has a portfolio, there are some that are going to want to only think about the next thing that's going to enter their portfolio, and that's all they think about. There's others who are going to look bigger and say, I care about the whole portfolio. Maybe your services can help me manage that portfolio. And even that second group, there's going to be some that have a different goal. How do I make my investments, be a little more active and help my investments succeed and use my investment to be better? And there's others that are going to say, hey, how do I find the bad ones and just get them out? And so the goals and differences, and those for me, if I was going to actually go after those markets, I would have very different services and outcomes and messaging for each of those, even though they're all, quote, angel investors. And so my barrier to succeeding in each of those groups, even though they have the higher level, very, very different. Some are easier to get to and some are later. And John, I'll be quiet. You probably have some other good examples. I can talk about 2 or 3 another ones that are clients on top of my head.
So we often have this question where people are selling broadly and they haven't figured out what their path to cash flow positive is. And so they're working on a bunch of things, talking at everyone. And the end result is they get some purchases from some and some hints that they will purchase from others, but they haven't figured out that they have completely different sales cycle times and that they actually wait for those other ones that are giving a hint that it'll actually be 18 months before they get a check. And that's just too long for them, right? And so we've seen that over and over again in the Seattle Angel Conference.
And it's really common, right? People use the old MBA model where they look at total available market, not lowest barrier to deal. And that kills them. They die. Again, part of not being clear about who you're going after can be deadly. And this is also
in terms of mitigating the biggest risk. Frequently, the biggest risk for a startup is we're going to run out of money before we get to cash flow positive because we haven't figured out the engine that produces revenue. And so putting that first, how do I sprint to cash flow positive, is the thing that then enables stability enough to figure out what the details are later.
Yeah, most of the startups I work with, they don't even have market segmentation done by the time they're telling me like, oh yeah, we have this live product and we're going out of business. Can you help us? It's like, I can try.
Yeah.
Patrick and John, as part of our assignments, we have one market segment that is for women and women foundations and women funds. There's 100 of them in the country. And we've had our first 5 30-minute interviews, and we can help all of them, but they all need radically different things, which was really surprising to me. Like we haven't found a second one yet that we could we could sell the same service to 2 of them, or different. Yeah. So that's interesting. Yeah.
And I would suggest, per the last conversation about gateway adopters, I would, from scar tissue, I would roll the dice and say all of them are late adopters. And if you showed them something new, they still wouldn't buy until someone else did it first. Just by odds, by pure odds, right? The chances that you've gotten out of that 70 or 80% group that's on the backside is small. Just, flipping a coin, you probably don't have them. So this is an issue we're going to talk about later on how you qualify and how you go through the homework of figuring it out.
Are you going to
go ahead,
Patrick? Are you going to elaborate on how you're what are the dimensions or facets by which you are segmenting those sub markets?
Yeah, we'll talk about that later. And I think in the second hour, I assume that I'm giving language, and we're going to talk about how I've done it. John's going to have, you guys in the audience will be able to jump in and tell. I can share with you what's been the best path for me. And, half of those are startups and half of them aren't. But usually it involves, to be frank, homework. And I'm going to show you some dirty, ugly homework that I do to make sure that I at least triage, triage what I'm not going to talk to. Who do I go in and say, not talking to you, not talking to you? And I know John wants to pull them in and spend time kind of understanding them so I can use them later. But I found that if I want to get to cash flow fast and I get a 10-to-1 ratio, I can't spend 10 hours talking to the wrong people to spend 1 hour talking to the right person. So I just stop talking to the other 9. And I'll talk about how I do that. Andrew, you're speaking. Did we miss you? Okay.
Sorry, I was speaking to one of my other.
Got it. Okay, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't rambling on top of you. Okay, so we'll talk about that. Now, another theme is what's compelling. So you're the customer, you're thinking through what you're doing. And again, these gateway adopters are really articulate about saying, is this a positive return that I'm going to get a competitive advantage? They know what they need to do to get ahead. And they say, well, I'm going to take a risk of stopping what I'm doing today, whatever that is, and adopt, spend money, go through a learning curve of adopting something that's new and different. Does this thing have a payoff? And, after a couple decades of having that conversation, I've spent a ton of time doing what I've called a customer value accelerator, where I talk about a language about how people really value. And the short version, we won't get into here, and I've presented to this group in the past on this topic, is value is not one-dimensional, it's two-dimensional, and these are 2 of the dimensions. And for this situation, like I said, this is gonna be a whole hour, but it turns out that there's 2 things you need to do. One is you have to make sure that the thing you're helping them achieve, the thing you'll market to, the thing you'll position against, the thing that they're trying to get to and their barriers are in the way is, does this goal matter? And that's super important because there's a ton of people who lose their house and go bankrupt with wonderful solutions that are told when they go in and they ask the question, does this solve your problem? They get positive feedback. Yes, it does. It's just not important because it's not addressing something that really matters. We all have tons of problems in our life, and the gateway adopter people know which ones are important and which ones are not, and they're just not going to spend time. And that's why there's an 85% attrition rate for cool new ideas, because if it doesn't address something that's in the top, they don't care. So you need to first decide if you're going to be compelling, it's relevant to what matters. And otherwise you're dead on arrival. It doesn't matter. Again, people losing their houses, it happens because they skip that first important gate. And then the other thing I kind of give a preamble to is, since there's 2 dimensions to value, you have to decide if the thing you're doing actually can give you a competitive advantage. And there's 2 questions are, is this something that's not expected? The market doesn't provide it. And I literally, when I'm in a conversation, I say, hey, what's expected? Would this be expected to do this? And if they say no, great, I might be on the right path. But then I also have to ask the question to make sure it's just not irrelevant. And there's a lot of, I've gone through many backlogs where 20 or 30% of their features are just, they're not expected and no one cares. So you have to ask the second question, which is, does it add value? Would it delight them if it was present in the product? And again, the tool I have and the decision tree that I just gave you a graphic of, I talked about it. I have a session on it. John, if people ask you, you can give them the session I gave recently about it. But what it does is you go through your backlog of stuff to see if things are unexpected and actually add value. And those are your opportunities to actually be compelling. And if you don't have any, you're in a bad shape. And if you have lots of them, that means that you're looking at multiple scenarios and you can pull one of them to figure out which one is the right one. And I've helped many teams triage to one delighter and cut their time to market by 3/4 in one meeting, where they realize they've got a whole bunch of competing delighters that all want to make a beautiful vision, but they don't sequence it. And I help them find one and actually cut all the other stuff that gets in the way of delivering one of them. You can't market to multiple, you can't position to multiple, you can't sell multiple, pick one. So again, the compelling is it's got to be important, and you got to be offering something that actually isn't expected and that does add value. Any questions on that before we kind of move on?
And I think people would like to have you be kind of specific about that conversation, right? How do I know that specifically, what questions am I asking of whom to get to? I know that this is something that I should do more of, or versus I should trim them out of the process. Because, I call some guy up and I say, I've got this great idea. Why don't you buy my thing? And all of a sudden my whole conversation doesn't work for what you just said.
Yep. I could do that here, but I've tried to sequence the next section to be that conversation where, and John, I've referred to this. I'm going to talk about the hourglass interview and how you structure it and how you conduct it, what it does. And that's where I'll start talking about how you use this insight, where you can test a hypothesis to say, will this thing be a delighter in the context of their goals and the challenges they have? And I'll talk about that in the hourglass section. You think that's okay? All right. So those are the three models that I've talked about, right? How do you define compelling? How do you talk about a market that's different and understand there are multiple submarkets? And then how do you define the person within a market to make sure you filter out the noise, even within any submarket? So, I'm going to talk about execution, things like what John just asked, and we'll talk about each of these issues and how I've helped teams go through it, and you guys can jump in. So my understanding is more than an hour, where I have a few slides. I'm going to talk about how I did it, and we can kick it around as much as you guys would like to. And even if you want to talk about what you're trying to do at each of these levels. And now that I've kind of created the framework, hopefully we can stay focused on the thing you're trying to do now. So bigger picture at high level, it's the lean cycle, right? What I do is I say, I'm going to mitigate your biggest risk about value by creating a hypothesis. And I'm going to pick one combination of what's the market, the person in the market, and what I think is compelling. Those three factors we've talked about. How I help teams solicit and get the right people in that market, and then engage them to have the conversation that John just alluded to. How do I test what's compelling? I'm going to spend a minute, and some people get a little esoteric on this, but I got to say, this is one of the things where people said they'd never do it, and as soon as they did it, they said they'd never not do it. How I help teams synthesize a bunch of messy conversations so that they decide how they're going to change their product. And then the process of, is this now have I mitigated the risk enough? Do I know enough to go on to another risk? And so that's what the next conversations will be about, and we can talk about each one. Now, so, what is the top market that I could be compelling to, that I could get to? When I say top, I mean quickest time to revenue for John. John, what's your favorite term again? Cash flow, quickest to cash flow positive. I think in revenue.
Cash flow now, yeah. How do I get the cash flow positive now?
Yeah. And so what I do with my teams is I usually have a conversation first, especially in the diagnostic, to make sure that this is the thing we should be working on. I first ask them, what does good look like? And just get the conversation on the table. And I think Mark was alluding to it earlier, where I get them to tell me what they think it is. And I put that in the context of what's my shortest time to revenue? What's going to take the least investment, not just in product, but in selling and marketing? What's going to be the least to be compelling on all those? And so there's a lot of development. And what are the risks? Well, we try to go into a market we know nothing about. I'm helping a client now who's going after a healthcare market, and they didn't know that certain characteristics of that healthcare market. We found out the hard way that engaging with that market has a couple of roadblocks. We'll get over them, but we didn't know. We didn't know when we started the exercise. So I start with that, and that you don't have to be specific, but we have the conversation, and then we start capturing what the candidates could be. So the conversation that, again, John does a great job of, he says, is it the government? Is it a student? Is it a, I walk through that. Is it a, let's think of the healthcare. Is it a ICU department? Is it a OR department? Is it a long-term care department? Is it a CCU? Is it a cardiac care? Is it all of these departments in a hospital have very different benchmarks for success. And my client had to figure out what was a sweet spot, because if they've solved this problem for decades, because that's a huge issue, then their new technology probably wasn't going to be that compelling because there's a big install base. Even if it's expensive and hard, people are going to have a hard time switching. And then the other end is, well, the thing we're doing, it doesn't happen very often in a bunch of departments. And so they had to figure out which type of department in a hospital had enough of the problem that they would be valuable and not. So we talked a lot about that and figured out, okay, there's this sweet spot when we talked about what good was, and came up with a list of organizations that was half the original idea. Then we talked about the tells of what the psychographic is. Let's say, okay, within that group, each of this subgroup, how will they be different when they're trying to win? What does winning need for their role? What are the risks for their role? For instance, we talked about if I walked into a department manager for an ICU and I said, hey, when you tried something new, what were the risks? And they couldn't tell me. Well, I had compatibility with technology risks. I had union risks. If they couldn't tell me these things, I knew I shouldn't talk to them. And then compelling. And this is where I'm going to actually show some Q&A and how I talk about what's compelling and what's a delighter versus what's not, at least in a conversation to get things done. And then this is still, you're documenting what could be, and then there's a process that can be really easy if you're a one-man shop, or it can be complex if you're a big shop, for how do you pick the one you're going to go after. This is where things are dynamic, because it depends on how expensive the swing is, how many people you have to get involved, and how hard it is to get there. You might make a triage really quickly, or you might use something that's a little heavier. And so I'm going to walk through that. So I encourage you to use what is essentially a stripped down, it's a weird hybrid that I use. That's not the business model canvas. It's a stripped down version of the core of that. And it's not the elevator pitch for startups. It's a hybrid in where I make sure you guys are very clear about those two issues that I've been beating on: what's the goal and what's getting in the way. So I ask for each of the candidates you think you have, once you've done a triage, be clear about the target decision maker that they want something. What's the outcome they're pursuing? With these, the goal, the things that get in the way. What are the challenges? What are the barriers? You're going to offer something, and it's a category. It's the category that they would recognize, not something new or different. You're saying, hey, I'm in this space that has a benefit. What's your key outcome for them? And it might be simply talking about mitigating one of their barriers. And I have my teams do this. I list the alternatives and then what the issues are with the alternatives, what they think is the shortcoming that is still in what they're doing today. That's, if it was great, wouldn't be a goal they need anyway. They would achieve their goal. So for something that has a shortfall, and I have them do the list, and then what you're offering, what your selling proposition is. And this is where then you say, what's my delighter? What is the thing that I'm delivering that other people aren't, that's going to help you get to that item number 7? So I have people do this. And again, if you're a one-man shop, maybe, you could do 2 or 3 of these. It might take an hour to do them. And this is where I get on my little soapbox and I say, the more precise you are about each of these levels and iterate through them to get really precise, the more likely you are to find that first compelling deal. Because when you're fuzzy, you get back to the story that John took, where they're talking to everybody but don't have the right thing for the right person. And the more precise you are, this discipline gets you to get very clear. And earlier I spoke about how I thought it through with my different potential angel investors. Each one's thinking a little differently because of their mindset and their investment cycle. So any questions about this? So I'll do, go ahead.
I think we should probably do a little tiny video about just filling that out with examples. I think
Yep.
that would be a worthwhile thing to do, but we don't have to do it now.
Okay. So the big, I'm going to, I'll call it the Patrick Hogan IP is people use the word problem and they use that for the concept of 2 and 3. And later on, when we talk about how do you structure a conversation with someone, I'm going to, you'll see where I say introduce these issues, because what I have found, again, scar tissue from 20 years of talking to potential customers for new concepts is people, there's a reason STEM takes years of education. There's a reason for it, because people don't have the models to go from symptoms to solutions to causes. They don't know how to layer the difference between what's the pathology that's underlying versus what are the symptoms and what's the cause and what's the desired outcome. They mush it all together in the word problem. And 20 years of using that word that I thought I was doing the right thing. And I went back and looked at my data and said, that was just noise. 85% of what I heard was desired outcomes, which is useful, but I if that's wasn't what you're looking for, it wasn't helping me get to the cause, tell me where I needed to go. Supposed solutions, people said, well, just do this, my problem will go away. Well, what do you mean? What's the problem? And they're like, oh, no, just do it different. So assume solutions or just symptoms. They would talk about the things they experienced and they knew really well, but they weren't relevant to underlying pathologies that I needed to go think about when I was trying to help solve a problem. So my key stump for this is be clear about what they're trying to do and be clear about what they're doing. And years of this conversation, people can tell you those things. They can articulate them accurately and consistently. So this is an ugly version of that, where the first column is those things. And I use it on myself, where I started out looking at investors and then I realized I had many permutations. So I created a bunch of candidates that every time I hit, oh, wait, I'd start with one and I'd have to make another column because they go, oh, this is a different one. It's the same title, but they have a different goal. Like, oh, this is a different one. It's a slightly different, it's the same person, but they're in a different place in their goals. And so I started making permutations. And like I've said, I've had clients easily blow this out to 9, where they had 9 different candidates. In fact, that seems to be a strangely consistent number, to be honest with you, which I find interesting over time.
It's where everybody gets tired and quits.
Well, I don't know why 10 is easy for them to say, no, that's not in. So, the message here is do as many of these until you don't have any type 1 error. You don't want to throw out what will be the lowest hanging fruit for you. When you realize, and you do a kind of I'm going to talk about how you make a selection, but you can run a test in your head and say, look, for sure, one of these others is going to be smarter, better than this, then you triage. But if you realize that, yeah, I don't really know enough to know if this really is going to be a loser, then you keep it in there. So you don't want to reject and not explore the one that could be the winner. So this is an example of me doing my homework. We can talk about that if we do a short version of filling that out. And then, okay, so what's the best option? So you have a bunch of them. Maybe you only have a handful and this is not an important part for you. Maybe you have a larger team and this is mostly, I usually have 4 to 5. I have a couple of founders that have strong opinions about what matters. Back to Mark's point, what's the factors that you choose? And then I tend to do a tournament model, even for the small group, where I say, what it comes down to, and you'll see this I talked about earlier, is humans are very poor at complex decisions. Their brains are not wired. This is cognitive science. I'm not making this up, because I wanted to find the best way to make this kind of triage. And so I looked very deeply into this. And when there's multiple candidates and multiple factors, humans make not poor decisions. They're not poor, they're just not the best. And they, for instance, in innovation, they almost always kill the most innovative idea because of dynamics and lack of knowledge. But what they are really good at is they're really good at A/B testing. They're really good about saying, how does A compare to B? And if that's all you do from this conversation and you say, yeah, the next 3 minutes are not interesting to me, if that's what you do, you're going to make better decisions. Now, what I do is I say, hey, I look at the candidates and I put them into a bracket tournament. And by the way, if you have more than one person and you have a team, they usually have fun with this. This is kind of bonding and a good experience. And earlier I talked about have a vision for your criteria. I have them be clear about what it is a winner looks like. It usually has 3 to 5, definitely not more than 5. I usually have 4, and it usually has to do with costs, risks, and upside, like quick, like is it fast? Can I get here quickly? And then I do a logarithmic scoring, 0, 1, 3, 9. And what happens is 0, 1, 3, 9 is not like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You get sore thumbs. The one that wins, wins. And everybody knows why it wins. And then I pick a winner. This is, if you have 9 of them and no one's ever done this before, it can take up to 2 hours. If people have seen this before and understand it, it can take an hour for the same 9. But you pick one. And this is how I've helped my team pick them, was the bracket tournament with some structure to the scoring. It's a little bit like figure skating or versus ice dancing on the Olympics. You decide what the criteria are, what competition you're doing, and then you pick the winner with your scoring, and everybody agrees. And by the way, I almost never have ties. It never ends up. I have it because I use a logarithmic scoring. The winner is clearly the winner. Everybody goes, okay, from what we know, we're going to go test this. Any questions? And again, if you don't want to do all the criteria and structure and want to guess, it's great. Just do it bracket. You'll get better results.
I couldn't get to the unmute fast enough for my question, but so first of all, I'm really hoping that you're going to make this deck available. I know John's recording it, but the recording doesn't always come out right away. So will we be able to get access to this deck right away? Because I'm furiously taking notes and I just can't keep up.
Well, obviously I can chat with you. We'll talk to John about how he wants to do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as I'm looking at this slide specifically, I'm thinking back to the last one and I'm thinking, okay, so I have the hypotheses and I have created several of those, and maybe I have 7, and and so then I organize them and I start looking at them and comparing them one to the next, and the criteria, I guess that's not clear to me. The logarithmic scoring, I always do that, so I'm totally with you on that. It really helps separate the wheat from the chaff. But with the criteria, what are the criteria that I'm measuring these against? You mentioned a couple, I guess. You said maybe how big is that market, or how quick, maybe how well do I know that market? Those kind of criteria.
Yeah, and every team is different, right? If it's a more mature team, it might be one factor, and if it's really early, it's another factor. And it's one that I think we've been beating on the most, which is which one will take the least amount of work to be compelling. And that has a combination of which will take the least investment, which is going to be the quickest to sell to, which is what is their buying cycle? And then I ask, what are their risks? Sometimes some of those split depending on the culture or the situation into two factors, like cost. I have a cost, it's ROI, like what's the potential return? How quickly can I get there? Cost, your investment, and that can do both selling and investment. And then risk, like you have to assess one, do we know more or less about the 2 competing factors? And let's be clear, just like a good basketball tournament, the score from the previous round has no effect on the next round. You throw out the score, it's an A versus a B. There's no cumulative scoring here. And so you're killing the project that's a loser, and moving on and doing another cleared sheet comparison, and you'll make decisions about, well, we know more about this market, so we're unlikely to make a mistake. And boy, that looks like a nice market, but there's a lot of things we don't know about it. So you might discount it for those reasons. So a cost, a return, and you guys can decide what return means. Again, low cost to develop might be, there's cost and there's big need, right? You think there's a need there. Which one of them has a bigger need? I'll go back to the hospital one. We had to find the sweet spot where they have a problem, but the bottom line doesn't have the problem very often, so they have to think about it. The other group had the problem all the time, and then we had to find the ones in between, and there was a scale even in there. So if you're at the top end of the sweet spot, it was more interesting to us than the bottom end of the sweet spot. Does that make sense?
Starting to.
So Patrick, if I may ask to try to clarify this a little bit in my mind,
Yeah.
You're saying like, all right, in the previous slide, you talked about like identifying like 4 markets. In this one, you're talking about like, refining from like 20 markets down, right?
I usually, this is back to every situation is different. I've had everything from 256 markets to 20 markets to 9, and then some with only 3. And I use a slightly different triaging model depending on that size. And if they're 20, I usually can, early in this, I said, define what your vision is. And we can usually triage it down to less than 10 by saying, hey, let's do a quick bracket. Is this market really, of these 10, aren't one of these 10 going to knock it out? And we usually can have that pretty quickly. And we go, yeah. Right? They've had this problem a long time. They're an installed base. We don't want to fight with the installed base. It's going to take longer. We may do it eventually. That might be market number 3 after we get data and established and it proved that we work. We might be the cheap option for them to do this, but not for the first customer.
Yeah. So in a way, you're kind of saying like in the first round, like come up with a bunch of like markets that seem to pass the sniff test of like they might be viable, but we need to think about it a little bit further and compare them to the other ones, right?
Yeah. Again, I'll go back to, I know I'm being a geek here, but if you're trying to find the one where you can land and get revenue quickly and survive, you don't want to make any type 1 errors where in the triage, you reject one that really is the best option. And like I said, when there's 20, I can usually be confident I'm not making any type 1 errors when I whittle it in half. Does that answer your question?
And then when you're going through this bracket tournament, I think what you're saying is that you like have 3 to 5 criteria and you score each company on all of those criteria and then like use a point system to like try to figure out which one got the most points.
It's an A versus B, right? And you really say, let's say it's risk. That's the risk model. It's like, do we know more about market A or know more about market B? We say, well, we know a ton about market A. Like, okay, 0 risk. Market B, we don't know much, so it's medium, 3. And then you'll compare that against your other two criteria, and yes, you'll sum up the score, and usually one will be a sore thumb because you're balancing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So
to be honest,
you might, for example, like be comparing 2 markets, and one of them is like super high on need, and the other one is like super high on they've got free disposable money, right? But they're
right,
and therefore they
exactly.
They're kind of different, and you hope that like there's going to be some sort of tiebreaker where one of them still like ends up beating out the other one because there's some other factor, like you can access them, for example.
Correct. That's the cost of sale is lower, or your work might be lower to be compelling to one, even though it's not the bigger one.
Yeah. Okay.
So if they've got lots of disposable money, you hope that you can get the cash flow positive fast in that market. That gives you a place to stand to work on the other market, right? So that sorting for me would be obvious, right? Do the disposable money market and make sure that you can solve their problem first, or figure out if you can solve a problem for them because the cash is sitting there, right?
Yep.
So I didn't want to rattle too much. I know John wanted me to have this separate. I just want to make you guys aware. And if you have more than 3 or 4 people in the room, I can just share with you that every time I've done this, it's been like a morale event, because it gets a bunch of the criteria out on the table and potential conflicts for execution get taken care of early. They're on the table, you know what it is. And even if you showed up to the party with one that didn't win, you typically know why the winner won and say, yeah, I'm going to back that until I find out that it's not what I thought it was, or mine's better. But I have had contentious teams enter a room with different positions and line up and execute that afternoon, because they understood why they were doing what they were doing. So this can not just a high value decision, but it can be a big team form or team esprit de corps creator, because they can talk about why they're doing what they're doing and execute even more exactly. Finding the right people. So this gets into some of the conversation that we had earlier about, well, what are we doing? How are we reaching out to people? And this is a boring slide, but it is the core of, I think, will be our discussion. And that is, I do this in 3 stages, and I think about the plan. And this is something Tom has seen this, because he went through a boot camp where we did some of this, where we did the prep work. We said, okay, how many people do I need? What is my funnel steps? And a little bit like what John talks about the R. Now, understanding that we're just trying to recruit them. We're trying to get people engaged, but it has some of the same characteristics. We have to decide, are you looking for 6 or 8? And you know, when I am helping a team, that's all I need. When I'm trying to tamp down the value risk, and I can get 7 gateway adopters in a room, the consistency in their feedback is so high, because I've filtered out everything else, that I don't need anymore. I almost always get almost 100%.
I lost you, Patrick. Can you back up a little bit? Are we having a network failure again, Stuart?
Yes.
Yeah, we had one. I'm back.
Good.
Here we go. So you need to decide what your funnel looks like. I usually have a small target. There's other people who prescribe to big targets. And I'll share why I'm nervous about that. Is I'm not trying to sell now. Selling would be great. I'm just trying to make sure that the value prop is right for the market I want to go after. And I'm not trying to go through a sales cycle. I'm not trying to verify that I can get cash from them. I want to verify that I'm solving something that matters. And that's why I usually go for smaller numbers. And you can look at what are your resources? Do you need email lists? Do you need to go other places? And then I work on 2 pieces of collateral. What's my messaging that I'm reaching out to people? Because I love to have messages that is about the value prop, and I'm kind of testing what I'm doing for a gateway adopter in that market. I don't want to listen to 70 followers or have to get rid of them before I, filter them out. I don't mind positioning and messaging. And then the qualifying questions for each domain. We know that they want to be winners and they want to try something new. We know that they're good at risk, and we know that they're good at satisficing and moving on, and they have a track record. For any one domain, you can use a different set of questions to actually, filter those pretty quickly. And by the way, the risk management issue, it's super simple. It's, do you know your risk before you try something you haven't done, and what did you do about them? And that is how those are the metrics that proved highly confident predictors of where people show up on the curve with really high.
Say those 2 questions slowly so that everybody can absorb them. Yes. I go to a new person and I talk to them, and in that conversation of setting the context, I ask them these 2 questions, which are?
Well, I ask the question, this is how I do it. the technique I use, and this is going to be part of what we do when I talk about the interview process to qualify them, is I say, tell me a story about a project where you did something that had involved stuff you've never done before. Just, and again, I'm going after a psychographic. So this is like someone being on the couch, right? And the classic psychology question is, tell me about your mom. And so what I'm doing is I'm doing that version. I'm saying, tell me about a project where you did something you haven't done before. And I listen for, the two questions that I'm saying in context are, did you know your risks and the types of risks before you took on the project? Did you know about them? And it turns out that half the market doesn't even know about them. They don't know. They can't talk about them. They can't tell you what they are. And so only about 20% of the market can have that conversation. And then the second question gets you down to the gateway adopter type is, when you ask them, well, what did you do about it? They will tell you specifically how they mitigated each of the risks, the models they used and how it fit into the project, and when they were done satisficing with it and moved on to something else. They articulate that very quickly. So it's, tell me about the project, and you listen for and probe for, what are your risks? Did you know them? And what did you do about them? Okay. And I'll talk a little bit about how you use that, but I build my collateral, right? So I'm going to plan. I know what my funnel looks like. I know my resources. I know what my messaging is because I have a hypothesis, so I can weed out. I don't get too much noise that I have to go through, and then I understand my questions for my domain, for my people in that particular market. What does winning mean? And then you can do recruiting, and there's a lot of ways to do it. Stephanie brought up several about how she's going out there and using surveys, or she's got her team who's doing digital marketing. I know Thorsten is really good about casting a net to go get people. So you can go to affinity groups. I know it's somewhere in healthcare. We talked about talk about one group that was doing cardiac care. And so there were organizations and affinity groups you could go to and approach and start recruiting there. And most of the time, to be frank, I'm learning again and again and again. So many clients say, oh, I want to do this digital marketing stuff. Almost, if time matters to you, you have to look at what it costs per week to be running, what's your burn rate. And it's always been cost effective to hire a recruiter. I only want 6 or 8. I don't want 100. And they have a network in their domain. They can do this on the side. I'll give them a few $100 per head, and they can give me the right people. And I'll do the last filter for psychographics. And then when you have to closing a deal is cheap because it's just it's a conversation, right? And that usually takes a week to 2. If I go get a good recruiter, I do it on the side. I can do other things. It works. I get the right people. I can get into the conversation. It's not cheap, but I find that it's speedy and gets me what I need to for the decision maker. This changes dramatically. If I had a risk, it was about usability. If I had risk about some other dimension, maybe selling, we were pounding on a different risk type. This equation might be very different. But I've always had good luck, even for usability and technical risk. I've almost always used just a headhunter to go out there and get those people and get them done fast.
How do you find a headhunter?
I use my network of headhunters, or I just go to LinkedIn and I look for a recruiter in a different specific domain. There are lots of them. LinkedIn has lots and lots and lots of recruiters.
When you say recruiter, you mean like a regular job recruiter?
Yeah, headhunter. I look for someone who's got a network in the domain that I care about. And because we're trying to recruit, in this case, right, our value prop risk is what we're trying to do. We're not caring about users. We're not caring about the technical team that cares about specific compatibility. We're not worried about performance. We're worried about, does our concept have value? They're decision makers. They're people with budget and making decisions. And so I have found the cost-effective ways to find somebody who knows that network and can go land some people that fit. Just like I was looking for a job that had a cultural fit, I'm looking for a persona that has a certain psychographic.
Patrick, I get that you have yourself proven that recruiters are the most efficient way to find a gateway adopter in the target market. But I'm going to assume that the recruiter is simply going through their own process, a process which Thorsten might be able to automate, or I can replicate. So what I'd like to ask you is, what specific process would the recruiter be going through that would be likely to give me 8 great gateway adopters? And when you've replicated it for yourself, tell me more about your process.
Sure. So the problem I've had with the digital media, using LinkedIn myself, is the models that I'm familiar with are somewhat time consuming. And I have found that the recruiter, in other words, you have to get a connection, wait for a response. It might be the right person, but maybe they just don't have time now, right? So you have a big drop off on the digital reach out model. But when I go to recruiters, especially for the executive level, they often have relationships with people that either they are the right person or they know the right person. And so the recruiter gets a response because of the relationship there. And that seems to be why it ends up being timely. And don't get me wrong, it's not cheap. You know, it might be $1,000 a head, $800 a head for the executives or a little more, but I would rather spend $8,000 now and know in a week than get bad information from something that took 2 or 3 weeks to form the right cohort and not really be as confident in it. So that's kind of been the trade-off. Like I have a current customer, they're using kind of traditional digital models, and they were a month in and we had nobody because they didn't want to spend that money. Does that answer your question, Tom, or is there something more specific?
No, you didn't actually.
Okay.
Sorry, but
no,
I get that what you're saying is that because they have relationships, that they have a Rolodex, that they are likely to get responses from their Rolodex. But it still comes back to what questions. What are we actually looking for? Well, we're looking for a different type of decision maker who knows our market and who uses certain tools in order to achieve specific goals for themselves to get ahead. So how do we find that person? If I'm a recruiter and I have a Rolodex of 10,000 people in my industry, that's fine, but I still want to come up with the answer to the question. How do I find those gateway adopters? Well, the recruiter isn't a gateway adopter specialist like you are.
No, that's right.
So what do you ask the recruiter to find you?
So the 2 things that I've done is I've created a job description, and you did a great job of this in our workshop, where you tailored the characteristics of the role we were going after to have these characteristics of someone who's track record of winning, trying new things. And I build that into the model that recruiters know. And so I give them close to it. And I almost always have a final interview process where, you know, I give them enough to know that I'm looking for close, and I usually get about 50%. So if I want 8, they usually show up with 16, and I end up whittling that last half down to be the people I really want. So by giving them the characteristics in the job description, I usually get pretty damn close. And like I said, I think you did a good job when you do. You do it better. You did in your example better than I've done it when you built those things in. Now that I have you an example, I've done it a couple more times now since then. But weeding it into what is the characteristics of that person, and you'd have to tell them that, oh, this is the gateway adopter characteristics, but you build those things into the recruiting process.
So you write a job description that describes the characteristics of the person you want to fill that job, which include things like you've had a history of successes. Well, the background, of course, is you know the industry really well and you know how to be a decision maker and you know the nuances of it. But then beyond that, history of successes, and you choose tools that give you an advantage in your career or in your outcome of your project.
Yeah, you have a track record of successfully adopting new capabilities that give you an advantage and help you be ahead, be a leader in your field.
Ah, that's interesting. Say that again, slowly.
You have a track record of adopting new concepts, and it doesn't have to be technology. It can be methodologies, training, engineering, new methodologies that help you gain an advantage or win in your. So this is where you tailor it to your. If it's healthcare, you don't say win, right? But you'll say be a leader in your area.
So I'm very sensitive to the fact that this is a room full of startup people. And I think you learned a lot of this using a recruiter when you're at Microsoft and you had a budget that is bigger than a lot of startups would have. And that's why I'm digging on this one is I don't think a lot of startups are willing to spend $8,000 to find 8 gateway adopters.
Yep.
So how can we hack this?
I would love to find a way. I'm just saying the last 2 or 3 times I've tried to do this, it hasn't worked. And I feel like we're a month late. I burned a bunch of cash and people have been building the wrong stuff.
But we got to hack this. So I'm going to work with Thorsten. I'll tell you, I'll take this offline because this may be too detailed, but I'll work with Thorsten to hack this and I'll come back to you and explain how we do it.
So Tom, we have Thorsten set up for January 7th to take this to the next step. So in fact, the hacking of this is doing the LinkedIn automation that's scheduled for January 7th.
Okay.
So go engage with Thorsten, make sure that the questions that Patrick is asking get put into his workshop.
Can I add to some to your nice to meet you first of all. My name is Kian. I have something to say about this this early customer findings. Based on what I actually got advice from John, our team actually did something that is like a milestone. We got some. First of all, I'm making tracking devices pre-embedded in clothing, so it's a new area. It lives in between fashion and technology. So the unique feature of our solution is group tracking. But so far, before we met John, our website was mainly focused on selling consumer direct, targeting parents. Then we realized that we haven't really utilized our really good function of group tracking, like 30 people tracking. So our salesperson start reaching out to these assistive tech companies, and they're basically online, like, if you do Google business search, assistive tech, and then like there were relevant other businesses that you can easily find out, and then you go to their each website and find the main key person or email them. And then we did that continuously every day, minimum like 3 companies we start emailing, and then we start getting attractions. And recently one of the companies approached to us. We actually have 3rd meeting coming up next week, which is dealing with 28 different senior centers, and then they are the buying purchase like company that is responsible for 28 agencies. So I think this is definitely, I found out it is the low hanging fruit and only like helpful for our quick cash flow. And also what we've been we have found out that we've been like this. I can tell you this, like this could be my analogy only, but let's say for your easy understanding, let's say you have super really great broccoli. You are a broccoli like producer, and you can focus on that only, but also you know, like in the meantime, you can find out what kind of dish you're gonna make, or even open up a restaurant that is specialized in broccoli. So what we've been doing is focusing on our technology being, wow, this is USPTO patented, we have 20 years, we have really good foundation, whatever. And then we were focusing on that broccoli only. We didn't realize that how we can go and then open up a restaurant. And finding out these companies, assisted tech, could be our broccoli buyers for now, for helping our cash flow temporarily. But in the long term, we are thinking of, like, actually in our back burner, we are building much bigger picture. That is only possible because we have start attracting attractions of immediate cash flow. I think that's
right. So you just defined an alternative submarket, which got you to cash flow faster, which now gives you the resources to go after bigger, longer sales cycle markets.
Yeah.
And so you did exactly what Patrick has been talking about.
Yeah. Well, as I was listening Patrick's presentation, I felt great that actually, yeah, it's very similar to what we did. And I'm very thankful for John's guidance. Thank you. And Patrick's presentation. Thank you.
No worries. So Tom, if I found the magic solution per what we've been talking about, I would be delighted. So don't get me wrong. I've run the experiment of trying others and to no fail so far. And I would love to see if I can do it. I try to do it for myself on some things that I got really positive feedback from my target market. And then I tried to do digital effort, including LinkedIn stuff. And I just didn't get the results that I needed in the time that I needed them.
Well, let me ask you a question, if you can. I know this is a little bit of rabbit hole, so say no, or John, throttle me back if you don't think this is on topic. In my case, we are looking to introduce virtual reality for debugging network complexity and situational awareness problems. It's never been done. So anybody that is interested in virtual reality who is, say, a CISO, a Chief Information Security Officer, is very likely, if they want to use it to solve their problems, they're very likely to be gateway adopters, I think. Is that a decent hypothesis for this?
It's perfectly reasonable. And I would suggest that if that's one of their number one issues, right? You have to find someone that actually, I think that we're going to open up this can when we get to the next conversation, when we talk about how we validate stuff. So if you'll bear with me in the next couple of minutes, and we'll get to the next level and see if this part of the conversation matters. So the high level of this section was have a plan for what you're going to go after. There's lots of degrees of freedom for how you do that. There's lots of ways you can go out and engage. I've shared my my scar tissue of trying alternatives, and there's people who are more imaginative than me that might find a better way to do this. I just find that getting a bad signal because you're talking to the wrong people kills companies, and I have them spend the money to make sure they're not getting a bad market signal on their value prop, and it hasn't paid off when I've tried other methods, and I'd love it to be the case. And I'll go here for a second. The model I have was developed over giant piles of data developed in a digital survey. So there are ways to ask this question online to get these qualifications. So it's not an issue of can we ask the question and reliably find them. I've just found the way I've gone about it hasn't been fast enough to get me what I needed. So, make a plan, throw out your neck, and qualify. When you pull the fish in, make sure they're in the target submarket that you decided you wanted to go after, and then make sure they fit the psychographic. Either using some surveys, I even have some surveys for qualification in the recruiting process, and look for the tells that we've been talking about for the people who fit the right psychographic. So now I'm going to get to a place I think we've touched on a couple of times, which, okay, you've got somebody, and I'm advocating for, in this early phase, it's not a survey that's going to get you what you need to know. You have to learn what you don't know. You have a hypothesis, but the fact that you're likely wrong is very, very, very high. And that being wrong could be lethal. And so you need to have a conversation, not a survey, because you don't know what you don't know. And this is the method I use, because you're in a conversation, you're going to ask about what you know, but there are blank spaces and white spaces that somebody you're talking to knows about, or even survey, and they can't tell you because you don't even know how to build it into a survey. So you have to have the conversation, at least at the early stage, to mitigate the initial amount. Shift it to it later, but when you don't know what you don't know. So I use what I call the hourglass interview. I've had really great success with this. It's some of the most popular sessions that I do when I do for product managers. So again, we've talked about getting the right people, and I had a set of questions that validate the problem space first. Is it important? And earlier we talked about, in order to be compelling, are you addressing something that is atop of their list? Does it matter? And this is to Tom's question about, hey, there's a group out there that has network problems. And if those network problems are really a big issue, the fact that you might show up with a VR solution that really does the job, hey, if he can do better because in his career and for his company, because that's a big deal, then great. The second part of the survey is this: what is good enough? What is compelling? And this is where I put the conversation about what is their metric they measure success by, and what's the benchmark for, okay, great, it's done. And you have your hypothesis, it goes into that neck, and then you determine if you're compelling or if you're not. And if you're not compelling, because you started the hourglass model, you know what is. If you find out you're solving a really true problem, but it's not important, you're going to hear what is, and you're going to have an opportunity to ask, wait, why is this big gap? Does this gap between what I thought was mattered and what they're doing matter? Then I go into kind of a very loosely structured kind of verify, understand if there's any hidden things in the conversation. It only happens about 10% that comes out, but I open it back up to make sure if I have a really imaginative person and we've learned this much about what we're doing, they can come up with some good ideas. So then I synthesize it. It's data, it's not action until I go through a synthesis process. So the questions I ask are, tell me about your top 3 goals and what are the top 1 or 2, well, 2 or 3 challenges that are your barriers. People are really good at that. And then why have what you attempted failed? So what solutions you tried and why have they not worked? Why have the attempted stuff you're doing? And you hear the competitive landscape. You hear what it is. You hear about the metrics for success or failure. The first 2 layers tells you what the issues are. This is going to tell you what good enough is and the thing you need to achieve in order to be successful and be compelling. This is where I talk about this is where I can then explore, my new concept has this delighter. I haven't heard the solutions that you've talked about have this capability or have this outcome. So I can now benchmark it against that context, the language they use, the benchmark they use. I can have that test. And then I open it back up. Okay, are there other new concepts that fit this need? What are the other goals or challenges that we may not have talked about? Because sometimes you jog their memory and you want to make sure you don't miss something. Then did I miss anything? So I do a pretty rigorous job ahead of the interview, having my hypothesis for all this laid out. And if you do that value prop scratch pad, it's pretty easy. So if I've done the competition and I know what my options are, if you look at the things that you did, even if you didn't use the value prop scratch pad to make a decision on which market you created, you actually use almost every line in this conversation to test your hypothesis. Are they the right people? Do I have the right goals? Am I right barriers? What have they done? What are their alternatives? And does the delighter that I'm thinking about actually work? And so it fits right into the conversation. So if you don't hear anything about your hypothesis, when they're done telling you, you can start saying, why didn't I hear about this? How down the path is this? You know, my war story that's most dramatic is a client who assumed that dev managers, people who managed teams that created solutions in code, their biggest challenge was they wanted to do it faster. They wanted to be more productive. They wanted to produce code quicker. And that turned out to be a non-problem. And the best way to summarize it is the people I talked to, the gateway adopters that I got into a room and I asked them a question, they all answered the same. I had a ton of options and they all answered the same, which is, it's not how I don't, one of them put it really well, says, I don't need to produce 30 or 40% waste faster. So being more productive doesn't matter. Making sure you help me produce the right thing is what has the biggest effect on them. And so they are really clear about that top nail, which is what should I build, not how should I build it faster. Now that was great because the client I was working with could take a slice of what they did, a small slice of it, and actually solve that problem without doing a ton of heavy duty technology work. But it was a huge difference, and that was a big gap between the hypothesis that the team had going in. And we could have that conversation, and took, one conversation with the group to actually totally cut 80% of the work that they were doing.
So Patrick, if I may ask a question about that. So it sounds like you're saying for the first half of this like list of things, we should not be telling them what we're trying to build or what we think the product is. We should be exploring it, and then after we understand more of their perspective, that's when we introduce the top what we think we could build for them, right?
And that's what I tried to explain in this, where the first part of the funnel is, am I relevant? Is what I'm thinking about even matter? Because this is where you don't know what you don't know. Are you solving a non-problem? Are you going to lose your house because you're doing a great job at something that doesn't matter for this persona? Once you do, then you listen to their language and you understand metrics and benchmarks that you have to reach. To be frank, I don't spend much time on, after doing this for 15 years, I don't spend a lot of time on this, on the assessment at this stage of this early stage, right? That we're hitting the value thing the first times, because when I hear the language, I can turn around and operationalize the metric and benchmark for what good enough needs to be for the concept. I don't need to spend time telling the person I'm talking to about my product. That's just a waste of time.
I mean, when you go into these conversations, they always have that intense curiosity, right? Of like, you're a product person at Microsoft or whatever. They're like, they want to know, like, what's the cool thing that you're going to build for me, right? And you're kind of intentionally avoiding that, right?
I am, and if there's a relationship dynamic that I want to keep, I might invest in sharing it with them. But I already know what they're going to react, because I already know what they think matters. And by the way, that sounds a bit arrogant, but because I've done this first questions over and over and over again, I have a very good lay of the land for what matters to them. And when I throw a new thing on there, I rarely do I get wild surprises. I've had the luck of having great stuff where they turned around and, that earlier cartoon from Futurama where they said, can I buy that now? Like, no, we'll have it. And again, that became that API. That was Microsoft's most valuable API. I said, well, this is what we're doing. And the guy said, I want it now. Again, I had gotten a gateway adopter and we had done a good job of understanding their pains. But yes, don't get sucked into product testing, John.
And so this is the point at which the technologists would say, no, it's not ready yet. I'll call you back later when it's ready in 18 months.
That's correct.
And where I, as a startup person, would say, sell them a slot in your development process today and take their cash today and make them be involved in the weekly stand-ups for that product, and find those first 10 or first 100 people who are early adopters, that are these gateway adopters who want to influence the outcome directly, right? And this is a place where the early adopters win in some sense compared to the gateway adopters, because they're willing to spend time playing in the mud with the pigs trying to do stuff. And you get a lot of feedback loop there. And at very least, you get a bunch of things you shouldn't build out of those early adopters. And then you can qualify that work against the ones that you've identified as gateway adopters. But as a business person, a startup should make a sale as soon as they possibly can, even if it's not a sale for the product they're building, but as a way to qualify that this person actually one of the early customers, as opposed to somebody who wants to be on the wait list, right? I can get you on the dev cycle. You can get one of 100 slots today, or I can put you on the wait list. And so when we release the prototype, you will be the first invited to that. Which would you like? If they sign up for the first, I know that I've got an early adopter. If they don't sign up, I know that they're a later adopter. And I want to focus and filter that, right? So the number one thing that I notice is that we talk about interviewing customers, and interviewing customers are people who pay, not people who are interested. And 98% of the people that are interested won't pay. So somehow you have to triage them out, even if they're excited and willing to engage. And even if they're gateway adopters, they're just not gateway adopters for this project, because this project isn't in the pile of things that are most important to them right now. You would like them not to be in that group of people. You would like the people who are going to buy this right now because it solves their problem right now.
Yeah, you're probably looking at a different market then. If you're going for a gateway adopter and you're not solving what matters to them, you've got to pivot. And I kind of actually, here's where I'm going. I do this after every conversation. It's geeky. Again, this is I was programmed in STEM from childhood, so I do this. And I found my teams go, what the hell are you doing? And then they won't stop doing it. Is when I'm done with a conversation, I pretend this is the only person I'm going to talk to ever. And then I say, what did I learn? And I go, what did I confirm? What did I disprove? I had a hypothesis and I'm wrong. What totally new just flew out of the conversation? And of that, what do I need to know more about? I look at that and I say, okay, I synthesize into action. What more would I do? Would I pivot what I'm doing? Do I do more of certain features? Do I do less of a certain features? So I make myself do that. Now, I might not take action now, but if I do this and I have 6 conversations, and this is why I usually get 6 or 8, is this list at the end settles down and the noise gets filtered out. And there are themes that I see at the end of it about what we need to do to be, if it's a pivot, the pivot starts to become clear of what really matters. If it's not, it's a refinement. What more or less I need to do starts to become clear in an organic way as I walk through each of those conversations. So I strongly, go ahead.
This is really, really awesome. That's why I'm asking so many questions. So what I'm wondering, if I go back to those 9 hypotheses that I had, and yes. I did the brackets and I get to the 1. And so then I get 6 to 8 people who are in the 1, and yep. I go through this exercise. And when I get to the bottom half of the hourglass, in every case, they didn't mention my thing.
Yep.
Okay. Now, one of my thoughts is, oh, I need to pivot and do something else. But is another one of my thoughts, okay, now I need to go to the semi-finalist from my bracket exercise and find another 6 to 8 people and see if that's a better hit?
So that might be what you do, right? You have a couple choices. if you, let's say the market, the market you went after initially, you went there because it's easy to get to them and you're relevant and you can make some revenue quickly. You may say, hey, per the story I just shared about the dev manager, they only need to slice off part of what they did to go actually be relevant to that biggest issue. So their actual time to revenue was way less when they, they were because they solved the problem that really mattered, not the secondary or tertiary problem. By the way, they all said, I wish I had that problem. I don't. I have a bigger problem that's much earlier in the issue. So you pivot. When I say pivot the product, is you reconfigure because you know how to get there, you know the market well, you know how to sell, they have money, you slice off what you're doing. Or again, one of the values of doing that tournament is it's pretty simple to go back to your spreadsheet about who won and lost and say, oh, what I learned about our stuff is this. Maybe this other group is really the right market for us. Let's say you want to, maybe you had to dev for that market. Maybe the pivot you had to do was going to take a lot of money. You might go back and find out that the lower hanging fruit now is a different space. So that's why this part of, do I dev more or dev less? Or do I dev differently becomes the feed for that revisit.
Hey, Patrick, how do you get people to spend a half an hour to an hour talking with you? I mean, everybody's busy these days.
So it depends on the role and the position, and the more senior they are, the more I have to entice them with a good value prop. And sometimes I dangle $100 or $200 to get the conversation going. But I will tell you, every time I do this conversation with them, they will spend 2 more hours with me. If I get a gateway adopter into this conversation, they treat it like therapy. They love it. So if you've got the right role, once you get going, I've gotten through this conversation and said, hey, I know what I need to know. Do you want to go farther? And they said, no, let's set up another hour. Let's have the conversation, because they're trying to solve these issues. They're trying to think it through. They're trying to prioritize, and they see value in this conversation. So I'll talk. I did this where I created a vision team of 6 of them, and we had a monthly conversation. As the project went, we just went back to them with, what are our biggest risk issues? And we just have a call every month, and we'd pile up the big risk issues and we'd go to it. And at one time we were doing it twice a month. And when we backed off to once a month, they got pissed off. They said, this is the highlight of my week. The fact that we're not having this meeting makes me mad. So they really love this conversation. And when you're always talking about what matters to them, actually, I'll go back and say, I did the survey I spoke of that gave me the data, that gave me the insight about what mattered to gateway adopters in general. And I got a 93% completion rate on a 20-minute survey with senior executives, because the triage of the survey was, what matters to you? Let's talk about that. What matters to you? Let's talk about that. So when you only talk about what matters to them, they will talk to you. John, he's raising his hand. We got 2 minutes. So my lesson is work on mitigating your top risk until it's not. And when you understand, you know, hey, I've got my value prop done, you'll move on to the next big risk. It might be usability, it might be funding, it might be team. John works very hard in thinking about the team working together and producing something, and then move on. So focus on this. I know that Tom thinks we should spend money, but building the wrong thing is what kills 99% of the companies for the wrong path. Even if it seems premium to do the engagement, it helps you get the shortest path. And then you shift to the new risk type.